because it's pretty unique in its approach to local network building and supporting community resiliency. And so I'm sure you know that gleaning provides value beyond the numbers, and I'm sure that is getting talked about. I wish I could be there and thinking about the pounds of food gleaned. But in this presentation, my hope is that we can give you a few ideas in thinking about your own programs for different practical and more theoretical ways that gleaning offers value, and that value can be communicated. So next slide. So thinking about gleaning as a communicative practice, I would say that gleaning is more than food recovery. It allows volunteers to be agents of connection in a circular and local food system. And so thinking about the role that volunteers play in that circular system. Also, volunteers tell stories. And certainly Sarah will say more about that, but stories about food waste, stories about the land, and stories about justice. And thinking about embodiment, like how it is that we come together in the fields, how we work to distribute, and working with the food that gets gleaned. And then lastly, I want to talk or think about a little bit about ethical witnessing. So seeing surplus alongside scarcity, going from seeing abundance to thinking about what that looks like when we, go to shelters and deliver that food to people who don't have enough. So I'll let Sarah then take away this next part and talk more about the program.
So Rachel's Table, originally for the first 30 years, was a program of a different organization. It was volunteer run. There had been some gleaning that had existed since 2007, usually around 8 private group gleans a year, harvesting maybe 5,000 or 7,000 pounds of food. And then Rachel's Table became its own separate nonprofit in 2023, where we received a large grant and we were able to scale up our community gleaning program. That's when I was hired, and a lot of the work I've done has been for our community gleaning program. I've attached this graph so you can just really see this big jump. 2023 is when we had this grant, and you can see through just truly powerful volunteer numbers and expansion of this program, we've been able to go from around 8 gleans a year to this past year we had, 103 gleans. We do private group gleans and we do open community gleans. Private group gleans are for an educational group, maybe for a corporate sponsor or something like that. So we're still doing a limited number of those a year. And then all of our other gleans are the open community gleaning program where anyone can sign up to volunteer. We've had a really exponential growth in poundage and volunteers. I'm just doing kind of quick stats, but 2023, 28,000 pounds, 2024, 50,000 pounds, 2025, almost 117,000 pounds. Did you want me? Yeah, that's perfect, thank you. And then I just wanted to talk about a couple different parts of our program and some parts that feel really significant to me. I think one really interesting thing is we've been able to be very responsive. We've brought on a lot more farmers each year, and we've been able to have the volunteer base to kind of scale to meet our farmer and agency needs. We're always trying to glean as much as our agencies can take. We're trying to glean as much as farmers can offer us. So many of you are responding to these same challenges of last minute availability and trying to get at places and all of that. But I think overall our program has been incredibly responsive to farmers and agencies, and that's really what allowed us to grow so much last year. When we had more agency demand, we had the volunteer base and the farmer interest to really scale up to just be sharing so much food around the region. One part of the program that I feel really strongly about and feels really meaningful is we always invite volunteers at open community gleans to tell us where produce should be going in their communities and what places we might not know about. Because of doing that, I think we've connected with at least 20 new places that we now bring produce to. Not all of them all the time, but when we can and when we have the transportation available, volunteers are doing a lot of the delivering after glean, so it's kind of a big logistics puzzle of where things go. But we invite people to tell us about, say, a community meal program that we don't know about, a one-time event that's happening, so many different places that could really use fresh local produce. And I think if someone's already connected with an agency or with one of these pop-up meal distributions, if they say, hey, oh, I'm doing this thing later in the week, could I bring, 50 pounds of this cabbage there? We allow them to do that, and that feels really meaningful. And often, if someone wants to have produce available for an event, if they can find a way to come to the Glean and get it there, usually we can make that work. We have a big ArcGIS story map of where everything went in 2024, and we're making our 2025 one. You can find it on the Rachel's Table website, and it's really just cool to see all of these webs of where produce is going in the region. And for me personally, as someone who loves to make a big network and learn who's already connected, who should be connected, it's a really fascinating part of my job just to get a better sense of who's doing what in the region. And then the final thing I want to make sure to talk about is that we allow gleaners to take produce home to share with their friends, family, community, strangers. And I think that's a really meaningful part of this work. And I think that, the produce, the poundage, all of that is awesome. But on top of that, the community connection and the ways that having this small bit of abundance can shape relationships is really just such a powerful part of the program. And just anecdotally, gleaners have shared so many stories with us through our gleaner survey, through just talking to me, through so many ways of just having, an extra 5 pounds of apples, an extra 20 pounds of cabbage has led them to meet neighbors, has led them to connect with someone on their street who they thought might need some extra food. Just all of these ways that they just continue to come back, and they come back to Gleans and they tell me, oh, because I had those apples, I met my upstairs neighbors, and they really love to make pickles, and I would love to bring them some of these cucumbers, and then we're gonna take the cucumbers and do this. And I just really, I visualize it with the story map we made, but also just through these stories, just these network webs spinning around the region of just even small amounts of produce really have these huge impacts on people's lives. And that's definitely feels like a huge reason for our gleaners of why they keep coming back, and just figuring out, especially during the SNAP crisis in the fall, just even more places they could be taking produce. And they'll say, hey, do you know about this low-income housing community? Has anyone ever brought produce there? Maybe I could be the one to bring produce there. I just see this initiative come up, and I see this message of what the program is and the way that they kind of take it on themselves. They understand the story of what we're doing, and then they're just looking for more places to kind of continue spreading the message, spreading the produce, making new connections. And then Leda wanted me to just briefly talk about the communication infrastructure we use. I send out a gleaning alert, which is a quick email just saying where we'll be gleaning each week, about once a week, to a listserv that has around 800 people on it right now. One interesting thing about that is last season I realized people were kind of seeing it as an accidental newsletter. It was never meant to be kind of a public-facing communication, but I realized people were reading it who didn't want to come to a glean and might never come to a glean, but it was interesting to them. And people started telling me that, and I was like, oh, okay, I'll lean into that. So the first sentence or two, I'll say just a little recap of something that's happened or something interesting happening in the region, and then I'll just keep it as minimal as possible. People don't want super long emails. And yeah, I think it's really interesting to think of it as a newsletter and to think of how we share information about our programs. And I was actually saying in a different session at one point, maybe 2/3 of the way through the season, I threw in a sentence that was like, it's never too late to come to your first glean. And I had 5 new people come that week. And I was like, oh, people are reading this. People are feeling singled out in this. People see it and they say, oh, that's me. I haven't been to a glean, but I've been on this newsletter. I send a big end of season newsletter that kind of not newsletter, gleaning alert, but it is a newsletter now that reports our poundage, that talks about what we've done, and I also kind of acknowledge the people who are just reading it as a newsletter. I don't know, just interesting to me. After the gleaning alerts, they sign up through a volunteer registration portal. They get a follow-up text with glean details. I have a work phone number that gleaners can call or text with questions about. We have organizational newsletter and social media that gets shared. We have an end of season gleaner celebration. With farmers and agencies, I mostly communicate through text and phone calls. We have a ArcGIS story map that I mentioned, and we also put out a big end of season survey that 75 gleaners took last year, and that really gave us a good sense of what we're doing, and they shared a lot of stories about their connection to the program, what motivates them to glean, the impact it has on them, the impact it has on their communities, other places we should be sharing food in the region. There's just a lot of really good data that we got from that. I think back to Leda.
Great. So I'm just going to so Sarah gave you a lot of great details about the program, and now I'm just kind of talking about it through the lens of social capital and communication ecology, and also through the interviews. So I'll say more about that. But first, I just wanted to say a little bit about volunteering more broadly, that, there are critiques out there of volunteering, and basically thinking about, both the good aspects of it, but also the tensions with regard to what it is that we do when we volunteer. And so thinking about volunteering in terms of the inequities that do get perpetuated, the focus sometimes for volunteers on their own individual needs, and sometimes even savior complexes. I'm saving people from food insecurity. The idea is sometimes that only privileged people do it. They have the time, they have maybe more motivation. A lack of diversity sometimes among our volunteers. And sometimes volunteers can go into situations with a lack of skills and cultural knowledge that can hurt more than it can help. And I think oftentimes too, thinking about, especially with regard to food assistance in general, how free labor gets used to fill gaps from cuts. And so these are all things that I think, just to kind of also point to some of the, some of the things that oftentimes get overlooked when we're talking about volunteers and volunteerism. Leaning doesn't resolve these problems, but it tends to be viewed less as an act of charity due to the multiple issues addressed, that we're both aiding farmers and reducing waste, feeding people nutritional food. Rachel's table, gleaners also build social capital and food system infrastructure. And goes back to what Sarah was talking about, and I'll say more about, because they also see themselves using the food for self-provisioning and for their more local networks of neighbors and neighborhoods. So we can go to the next slide. So some of the research questions that I wanted to focus on for this study are basically looking at how does gleaning generate social capital, what communication ecologies emerge, and how do participants describe meaning. And so I had each of the interviewees write a little map of how they saw themselves in relation to this process of gleaning. And I had a sample here, and it's probably, I don't know if y'all can see it, but it's kind of like connecting Rachel's table to different farms. It's like weirdos, this person put. But some of the volunteers in a loving way was talking about this kind of like little group of weirdos that he enjoyed being part of. And so those were basically the ways I was framing the project. So next slide. So the theoretical framework, I mentioned this social capital, which has been kind of studied in different ways, but I was going back to Bourdieu and the idea of what people kind of bring to the table in terms of resources, and these can be inherent resources that come with, race, class, gender, et cetera. But also thinking about what we do with those resources in bonding, which is more in the group, bridging across differences and linking as a way to advance people, but also communities. Most studies of social capital, I want to say, look more at inherent. So like what people have already as resources that they bring to the table. And I wanted to focus somewhat differently here in thinking about emergent social capital. So how do we build social capital through our work with other people through gleaning? And so this is kind of thinking about what's happened through the program. So next slide. The other theoretical framework I use is communication ecology. And basically, communication ecology looks at how narratives adapt and change across networks. So basically, there's a story about gleaning. How does that change as different people take it up and use it in various ways in their own lives? And how does it change for the people who tell it as well? So basically looking at different layers from interpersonal to organizational to like thinking about social media and other ways that people communicate, and how that, like I said, how that story adapts and changes across contexts. So next slide. Just to give y'all a little idea of the literature that I brought to this, was thinking about food justice, volunteerism, social capital and food systems, and communication ecology. And also just thinking about how in general in the alternative food movement and alternative food systems, and the way that's been studied in the research is a lot of times on the physical infrastructure, and how do we think more about the social infrastructure that gets built. and what that looks like and how that becomes meaningful for people. So next slide. So also, I just wanted to tell you just a small part of the methodology. I was doing qualitative interviews. I interviewed about 11 people. The participants were volunteers who I classified as active gleaners who had been to, I think it was like 10 or more gleans. Most had been to more than that. And they were aged between 35 and 70. And I mostly did a thematic analysis along the lines of thinking about social capital and communication ecology or infrastructure. And the questions that I asked were basically all around relationships. So they were relationships to yourself, relationships to the land, relationships to other people, relationships to the community. And so each were kind of grouped under those larger classifications. So given that, the first theme, you can advance to the next slide. The first theme was relationship building, and so how that happened for different volunteers. And so we would talk about it in their own stories about intrapersonal relationships, so their relationships with themselves and what happened as a result of gleaning. More feelings of self-confidence, especially for folks who were kind of newer to the area. I heard that a lot. Feeling like they had autonomy over some decisions, like where they wanted to deliver the food, and they saw themselves as kind of a connector between the food and people. And I think, again, this goes back to Rachel's Tables program. As Sarah mentioned, that sense of autonomy that people kind of picked up and ran with. And so this also led into the next theme of identity. And so a lot of people said, like, I tell everyone that I'm a gleaner, and then they ask me, what is that? And then I tell them what that means. And so in that way, they become both an advocate and also like it gives them a sense of identity. And then land also, like to them personally, what it produces and gives, and being a witness to that. A number of people brought up mental health. They brought up how they saw gleaning as kind of like an act for their own mental health. And I think that's something that maybe goes under recognized, the role that plays. And the next area was interpersonal. So thinking about repeated interaction, like working together in the field. And then many brought up how they used gleaning as a way to deepen their ties with their friends and their family. They invited people they cared about to glean with them, and then, got to talk about that and witness that together. And then last was in the community, building relationships. As I mentioned before, that kind of idea of we're building this web, as Sarah said too, and it's a web that is constituted by saving, sharing, and advocacy. So we can go to the next slide. And these were just some sample connections. I mean, this is just, random things that people mentioned. Gleaning with my daughter. I brought my daughter to a glean in Whately. We discovered a farm I didn't know existed. My daughter harvested kale for the first time, and then there were just different people that, different people met, and they would just say, oh yeah, I met Steve, and later discovered he's a brother of my friend Joe, and met another man who I later ran into again at my friend's yoga class. And everybody told me this over and over again. Like I met someone at a glean and then I saw them, and there's just a way to kind of connect through that. So we can go to the next theme, the next slide. The next theme was bridging difference. And again, this goes back to kind of thinking about social capital. And so a lot of people talked about, getting to see behind the scenes both in the farms that we went to and also in the shelters. And one volunteer said, I saw farm workers at these different farms, and I felt like I saw their work for the first time. I hadn't really thought so much about what they were doing. And the same when I went to the shelter, I had never seen kind of behind the scenes in the kitchen and how people were working to feed other people. And then just witnessing contradictions. By that, I mean, basically like going from a farm where you see all of this extra, produce, and like thinking about like all this abundance, and then thinking about like, all these people that are food insecure. And so many people brought that up, like just this, like in a sense, I don't know if the right term is necessarily contradiction, but it is in a sense that there is abundance and scarcity at the same time, always in this food system. And then working on circles. By that, I just mean thinking about like, where things go. Like we produce this food, where does it go? How do we make it more productive? How do we continue to think about reuse? And so for a lot of volunteers, that became like something that was more brought to their attention and that they continue to be aware of. Where does the food go? So the other thing was just the diversity amongst volunteers and like, you know, witnessing each other's differences and how we each kind of thought about, you know, what we were doing and our reasons for being there. And then a number of people brought up political and policy connections, so that they would then like ran into a representative and told the representative about the program, and then that representative came to the final end of year celebration and then became more aware of the program and what was going on. And so in different ways, different volunteers were making connections to policy that were very important to them, but had like larger rippling effects. And so next theme, next slide, please. So another theme was just communication is connection and coordination. So a lot of people talked about what Sarah brought up earlier, just the ways that Rachel's Table uses communication, the emails they saw as kind of invitational, and they appreciated, just like for them, it was an invitation to commit to doing this work. And then again, the numbers became like a point of stories that they shared with other people. You know, so we gleaned this much, and so that when these emails came out, it was a way for them to then like confirm their participation, to feel good about what they did, and also to show other people that this kind of work was important. And then just the last part was the idea of the coordination and the logistics for people was really important. So, and the role that they play in that as well. The last theme is just thinking about embodied communication. And that is just, for many people, brought up the connection between the mind, the body, and the land. And so thinking about feeling grounded, like many people brought up just like putting their hands in the soil, and brought up weather a lot, like leaning in the snow, like feeling, you know, incredibly cold, the pouring rain, but also just seeing together what we were able to harvest. And so I think that that was something that many people felt like the role of that their body played, also the physicality of it, if that makes sense. And then I talk about remembering in the sense of like becoming a member again, like in the sense of like how we like establish our relationships with people. And so they saw gleaning as a way of like deepening those relationships with people that they already know. And then also remembering in terms of memory that people brought up, like, you know, I worked on a farm as a child, or I grew up on a farm, and gleaning with parents when they were children, for many people was important. It brought back memories of gardening for a lot of people, and these memories became really important part of what they did. Um, and the last part is more kind of abstract, but there was this sense too of like the love that was involved in doing it, the love of seeing what the land produces, the love of being able to give to other people, and this labor of discernment. By that I mean this kind of like idea of like the role that we play, or I say we because I also am a volunteer, but the role that we play in deciding what will be included, what will be you know, distributed to shelters, and what gets left behind was a big thing that people thought about a lot. So I wanted to include that as well. Okay, so that's you know, that's about it for the theme. So we can go to the next slide, and I'll just say more about like social capital. And so when we look back at, you know, the different interviews and what people were saying, I thought about like this aspect of agency that really came up a lot, and also empowerment. And so thinking again about the autonomy that this program provided for volunteers to kind of to build their own networks of distribution, and also just, you know, shelters that already they knew about to give to. But thinking about, you know, the creativity that gets involved, that I can make those decisions, was important to people too. And then advocacy on relational and organizational levels, that they became like huge advocates for gleaning, and then brought that to their workplaces or brought that to other institutional places that they were a part of, and that became like big for them, whether it's their workplace or their church, or other organizations that they were involved in. And then just again, the access to resources for their self, neighbors, and community was really important, an important part of the capital that they felt they had gained as being volunteers, cleaning volunteers. So we can move to the next slide. And I apologize too. I feel really disconnected doing it this way, but this is my first time I've ever done this virtually. Communication, the model that I talked about earlier of communication ecology, was basically like thinking about mapping their narratives, from volunteers to their friends, neighbors, workplaces, politicians, policymakers. Like, how did that flow in their stories? And we could see, like, through the physical maps that they drew, but also through their stories, those connections getting made that, that Sarah talked about earlier. So I think it was both through the stories, but also through the drawings. It was interesting. And then thinking about farmers and farm workers and the stories that they pick up and tell about gleaning, which I didn't get to here, but are also part of this communication ecology model that then works on nonprofits and other agencies that Rachel's table works with. And then just again, going back to the way that the communication is done digitally and face-to-face. So the stories people tell each other, as well as, the weekly alerts and the volunteer signups. So it just basically goes back to how these things flow. And I think that that's the mapping part that's extremely important. And that, like I said before, is maybe you all can take up and use in your own programs as a way to think about, how this information, how these stories become, adapt and change and spread. So next slide, just to talk a little bit about the critical tensions that I think underlie this kind of work. And so thinking about food justice more broadly, which I do a lot, is thinking, for me too, something that I often wonder about is what actually does food recovery do? And I'm thinking about food recovery more broadly than gleaning here, but thinking about, like, what role does it play in the larger food system, given, especially in the United States, the amount that gets produced, and the amount of waste that's out there. So what impact does gleaning have on actual production? Which I would argue is little. As also a farmer, I know that we have to overproduce, but then thinking about what gets done with that, I think, is really important with what gets produced. And then just thinking about labor in the food system, and the role that volunteering does, which sometimes is supporting a system that's already unpaid or underpaid, for labor. And I think that that's also something, when we take a step back, to think about a little bit. And I would just say the gleaning interrupts some of these things. When we think about the value of crops overall on the dollar, and the value of food that gets determined by commodification, in this country especially, the more a product is commodified, the more, we pay for it. And so that things like, crops on the ground, are worth actually very little in the grander scheme of things. So I just, those are some of the larger tensions that I see that are out there. When I talk about visibility, thinking about, what gets made visible and what gets hidden when we talk about a lot of these issues, and the positionality of the volunteers in the program, the fact that most folks are white, most folks are, I'd say, middle class. But it's an aspect too of volunteers in general. I think, who can volunteer, and the time that we, put into it. And lastly, just thinking about power and who controls production, distribution, consumption, who controls basically, like, the food chain, and what role, gleaning can play in that. So those are some of the larger critical tensions. So just thinking again about the contributions of this study, if we go to the next slide, I would say basically, like, thinking about gleaning as a communication practice can be really useful. Thinking about how people make meaning of gleaning and what we do in terms of themselves and their relationships can be really helpful. We in this work, I tried to expand a little bit on social capital theory by looking at emergent social capital, and also thinking about how networks of communication shape and expand the nonprofit narrative, I think can be useful as well. So we can move to the next slide. Some implications of this work is just thinking about the possibilities and challenges of volunteer autonomy. Because I can imagine that there can be some challenges to that. Maybe Sarah can say a lot more about that. But also, localized networks and how those get built. Gleaning also can provide, I think, what I call low-key food justice. But I feel like food waste and food insecurity remain growing and individual wicked problems that, to me, I say individual because I don't see them as necessarily connected in the ways that a lot of people want to connect them. And lastly, I would say that mapping relationships and networks show interactions between people, food, and meaning making that I think can be really important. So we can go to the next slide. Obviously, there are some limitations. This was a case study based on the uniqueness of the program, which I was particularly interested in, and the area, the geographical area itself, which I would say Western Massachusetts is a pretty unique area. And it's not obviously intended to be representative. I think it would be interesting to do a more longitudinal study of this type of program, and also comparative studies across different gleaning programs and their networks, I think would be extremely interesting. And we can move to the next slide. So lastly, I would just say, gleaning connects people, land, food, and what I would say are broken food systems. Rachel's Table volunteers build social capital in unique ways through agency, activism, and network formation. Gleaning can function as ecology, and like an ecology, it operates through interconnected hierarchical levels, ranging from individuals and neighborhoods to communities and ecosystems, focusing on energy flow, nutritional food, healthier people, and the distribution of food and shaping of meaning. So, it's the physical aspects of food, but also, the meaning that gets made of it as well. So that's about it. We can go to the next slide. Just Q&A. Thanks. Thank you.
Grab the mic. So there's a question.
Here, do you want to read it?
Sure.
Oops,
but I'm going to give it back to you.
Yeah, that's fine. Here.
Okay, there was a question in the chat a little while ago when you were talking about those accidental newsletters and finding people that you didn't know. We're interested. What software or service do you use for mass emails, like accidental newsletters, etc.? I feel like it's so important. It's so important that the volunteers feel like it's personal, but not sustainable for such large numbers. And if the answer doesn't come the right way, the person in the chat is going to tell us. But if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Sounds good. And yeah, anyone's welcome to email and follow up about any of it also. We use Little Green Light as our main volunteer and donor management platform, and they have an email function inside of that, that's where I send the gleaning alerts from. We also use MailChimp for our volunteer newsletter that goes out, but I don't use that. We have a number of different systems. One interesting thing I was saying earlier today was we used to do the kind of auto insert name thing that says hi Sarah, this is your gleaning alert. And people would email me back and they'd say, sorry, I have a dentist appointment on Tuesday. And I was getting so many of those emails and I was like, why are people emailing me like this? And I was like, oh, it's because it's their name, it's too personal. So I actually found that to be too personal. So I've switched to saying, hello gleaners, so people hopefully know they're on my giant listserv, because I really was getting so many emails every week of people telling me their schedule. One interesting thing, also thank you Leda, that was great, and I haven't heard Leda's full presentation yet, so I feel like it gave me a lot to think about, which was awesome. One thing it made me think of that I forgot to say was, after every glean, at least since last year, I try and send a follow-up, and I know many people have nice automated ways of doing this. Currently, we only have a manual way of doing it, but I say, thanks so much everyone, here's how much we harvested, and here's where it went. And it was really cool to hear you talk about the gleaners, specifically talking about receiving that information and that being really useful to them. And one other interesting thing I forgot to mention, but something else Leda said made me think of it, was I looked at my list of new gleaners for the community gleaning program this year, and the majority of them came because they personally knew someone who had been involved with the program. And like I said, we really have an abundance of volunteers right now. We do outreach in a bunch of different ways. And I think for the gleaning program, just I took little notes like, oh, this is so-and-so's friend, this is so-and-so's parent, this is so-and-so's kid. Like, so many people really were bringing family and friends with them. I mean, Leda's been involved in Glee, and she knows. And it's so fascinating also because it really, the social aspect of like bringing someone in to meet your community, like I could tell for many people, it wasn't just like, come do this activity with me. It was also come and meet the rest of the Gleaners who I'm spending, 1 to 3 times a week with. And I don't know, just very fascinating to see that people reflected that back to you also.
Yeah.
Any other questions for me or later?
I think we're almost at time. If we have one question, the most burning of questions. Okay, I think you're gonna have to find Leda online, Sarah here in person. Thank you so much. We give them a round of applause.